Hi, welcome to a new episode of our podcast series about cities. In this episode, we are heading to Luleå in northern Sweden, not far from the Finnish border, on the Gulf of Bothnia. I first visited the north of Sweden in 2022 during my 3-month train journey through Europe. This August, in 2025, I went back again.
Hi, Evert. You've just returned from Sweden. Tell me what it was like there in the cold north. I understand you went to a conference in Kiruna. You also told me that during the week you would be visiting a number of places that all have something to do with green steel. Let's talk about that green steel first. Then, in a subsequent podcast, we maybe can talk about Kiruna and the conference?
Yes, let's talk about green steel. It's important to know that it is not the steel that is green, but the production process of that steel. The factories to produce huge amounts of fossil-free steel here in the north of Sweden are under construction, and that steel will be produced without releasing any carbon dioxide. Considering that the production of all steel in the world currently contributes 8% of total carbon dioxide emissions, it is obvious what the implications of fossil-free steel can mean. To better understand this, I went on an excursion organized by Lulea University. We didn't just visit the new green steel plants, we also saw a derelict blast furnace from a century ago, hydroelectric power dams, a fortress, a church village, and a museum of the Saami people. I have used all that information to create a story in 3 parts. First, the rise of iron and steel in the world history, with a special focus on Sweden, the Vikings, and the mass migration to the USA. Then, the development of the North itself, with the first blast furnaces and the hydroelectric dams, which prove that the combination of raw materials, logistics, and people is essential. And finally, the third revolution. The meaning of fossil-free steel and the enormous impact it can have on the world.
Where did you fly to for that excursion? Are there any airports nearby?
Oh yeah, there are airports, which is very practical. The steel plants need people to come in, while these new processes are being tested. But this is all temporary work, where people were flown in, both in the literal and in the figurative sense. I myself took a train. I had done that once before, and it gave me the opportunity to visit some other cities on the way to the Arctic Circle, such as Copenhagen, Stockholm, and Umeå. I had already been traveling for a week when I arrived in Lulea. That train also made me realize just how far away you are here. It seems like another world, a world with beautiful light, lots of forest, and wonderfully clean water.
Okay. Copenhagen, Stockholm, Umeå, and Lulea. I remember you were in some of these cities some years ago on your way to Harstad and Helsinki. Tell me how it was, Lulea.
Lulea is a small city of about 80,000 people, situated on the northern edge of the Gulf of Bothnia, the stretch of sea between Sweden and Finland. In winter, the Gulf freezes and icebreakers are needed to keep the harbor open. Lulea is not beautiful. You don't go there for architectural beauty. It is all a bit austere and plain. The real appeal lies in its surroundings, the water, the forest, the islands, and, of course, the northern lights. But that beauty also comes with a vastness. The same landscape stretch across all of northern Scandinavia. What does not help is that almost all of the shops of any significance are located in a huge mall outside the city, which is hardly accessible without a car. It is very American. Large car parks and lots of ugly boxes. The result is obvious. The center is home to just a few restaurants that are struggling to survive. This completely disrupts the ecosystem of what I would call an attractive, compact city. I arrived in Lulea in the afternoon. Fortunately, most hotels are still located in the city center and not on top of these shopping malls. So I had time to take a walk. The hotel was fine and had all the modern conveniences.
That is where your excursion began. How many people were there with you?
The group turned out to be very small. There were 6 participants in total.
Where did you go first?
The first place we visited was a traditional blast furnace near Lulea, owned by SSAB, Scandinavia's largest steel producer. Until now, almost all of SSAB's blast furnaces have been in southern Sweden. And that made sense, logistically. Coal and coke were easier to bring in, and the labor market there is probably bigger. Now those same logistics are pushing production north. This time, the crucial factors are different. Iron ore and cheap electricity are abundant in the north. And what is missing are the people.
Before we continue, could you go over how the use of iron developed? I mean both the early beginnings with charcoal and then the later breakthrough with coke. Because that history helps us understand the scale of what fossil-free steel could mean today.
Metals can be extracted from stone by heating it. The Egyptians already knew that. With small clay ovens and charcoal, they melted copper from stones that contained only a few percent of the metal. Mixing copper with tin gave bronze, strong enough for weapons and tools, though limited by the rarity of tin. Every substance in nature has its own combustion temperature, the point at which it catches fire. Picture a campfire or a barbecue. You start with the firelighters. These burn at a low temperature. Then the wood starts burning. First you see white smoke, which is water vapor, evaporating at 100 degrees. And then a combustible gas is released from the wood and whoosh, there is the flame. These flames occur at around 600 degrees. And then, when the flames are gone, because that gas is used up, what remains is glowing charcoal.
That glowing charcoal gets much hotter, right?
Once everything that can burn easily has disappeared from the woodpile, what is still there becomes much hotter. The temperature of the charcoal can be hotter than 1000 degrees, and that is when you put the meat on the barbecue. And that is also when the iron ore starts to melt. Extraction of iron from iron ore became much more important than the extraction of copper. But working with iron turned out to be a lot more complicated. Iron requires even higher temperatures. Small stone furnaces, known as bloomeries, were built to heat iron ore with glowing charcoal. And then, when the fire went out, all that remained was a lump of iron, and that could be forged. This was done on a small scale, and production was limited, but it is how the Iron Age began. Revolutionary.
use of iron has had an enormous impact on world history.
Yeah, you can say that. The most important revolution was brought about by the combination of horses and iron. With iron horseshoes, horses could carry heavier loads and work longer. And thanks to the horse collar, which was made of leather and wood but often had iron fittings, a horse could push a cart with its chest, allowing it to move much heavier loads than before. Iron ploughs also made agriculture far more efficient. It increased yields enough to feed many more people, and that resulted in the establishment of trade routes and the emergence of the first true cities.
But surely there was a downside too.
Well, that depends on your perspective. The people that were truly affected by the downside were the ones who did not have access to iron. Iron was used to make better tools, but also better weapons. And this gave societies with access to it a significant advantage over those without. Since we are in Sweden, you might immediately think of the Vikings. In their time, they spread their influence and control over vast territories, from Britain to the Black Sea. Their axes and swords were of a quality that was difficult to match in Europe at the time. Did you know that for many years the elite Varangian Guard in Constantinople, the bodyguards of the Byzantine emperors, was made up of Vikings from Scandinavia?
I did not know that, but there were also the Normans, whom were descendants of the Vikings.
The Normans in Normandy were indeed descendants from the Vikings. The name says it all. In 1066 they conquered England, and they were able to win because they were armed with superior iron swords and were experts in the use of cavalry. They rode on horseback, protected by their own chainmail, and their disciplined ranks were a decisive factor in the battle. The English are still traumatized by this loss today.
Let's not forget to mention America, as it was found by Columbus, where people had never seen a horse and were unfamiliar with the use of iron.
What happened when you did not have horses and iron became clear after the Spanish conquistadores arrived in America. Columbus was certainly not the first European to set a foot on American soil. The Vikings had been much earlier, but they saw no point in conquering it. They were too few in number, the supply lines were dangerous, and besides, they had no idea what America could offer that they didn't already have. Columbus was a different story. His ships were larger, his goals were different. The second convoy alone brought 17 ships with some 1,200 people to America. That was no longer a voyage of discovery, it was the beginning of colonization. The European conquerors, and in that first century they were mostly Spanish soldiers, officials and missionaries, were neither intellectually nor morally superior. The idea that they were is a story they invented in the later centuries to convince themselves and to justify their misconduct. The indigenous people of America were easy prey. They had no horses and no iron.
Speaking of the global impact of iron, there you were with the Swedish steel manufacturers. If iron was so important, why was a country like Sweden so poor during the Industrial Revolution? I always thought Sweden was known for its iron.
Sweden was a poverty-stricken country in the 19th century. It had long been known that there were enormous iron reserves in Lapland, near Kiruna. But those reserves were too far away. Transport to a port was virtually impossible. The harbour of Lulea froze in winter, and all other ports were much too far. Meanwhile, the Industrial Revolution was in full swing in places like England. The breakthrough there came not from ore, but from coke. Purified coal that could reach much higher furnace temperatures. And that was a revolutionary development, but Sweden lacked the right kind of coal to join in. They had the ore, but not the technology to use it on an industrial scale. And at the same time, Swedish society was full of contrasts. Thanks to the Protestant Church, literacy rates rose to near universal levels by 1900. Almost everyone in Sweden could read and write. The Protestants wanted everybody to be able to read the Bible. And yet the country was still desperately poor. Alcohol abuse was widespread. Early in the 19th century, the Swedes began distilling aquavit from potatoes, and consumption shot up to 40 liters per person per year. It was a society educated but struggling.
The use of coke to produce iron saves a lot of trees.
For the first time, forests no longer had to be cut down to make iron, and the iron that came out of the blast furnaces was of a much better quality. At first, this mainly produced cast iron, a brittle metal. But over time, it became possible to make better and better steel from it. And this enabled the development of steam engines and the mass production of railway tracks and locomotives. From around 1830, trains began to run all over Europe.
Steel not only made railways possible, it also completely transformed shipping.
The new steel plates were pivotal in enabling the construction of significantly larger ships, and these ocean liners enabled mass migration. Between 1850 and 1915, the United States admitted millions of Europeans. And from Sweden alone, some 1.3 million people left. That was almost 30% of the population.
So coal and steel are very dependent on each other.
Coal and steel are part of a large industrial ecosystem, which we still refer to today as the heavy industry. Coal and steel have been inextricably linked for over 200 years. Coal is heated in coke ovens to release gas and leave coke behind, and that gas powered the city lamps. And the other substances released, such as PAX, ammonia, cyanide, are raw materials for the chemical industry. So steel was used to make the trains and the ocean liners. And the cities, they built railway stations, museums, operas, because visitors needed to see something when they visited. Hotels were built, and this is how tourism began.
So that steel really did have enormous significance.
Steel did not only change technology and the economy, but also everyday life. Those new cities in America could only be built thanks to steel. Subways were constructed, a real railway network was created, bridges with much larger spans were built, and ocean liners continued to bring people in. And on the return journey, they mainly carried grain, cotton, meat, and other agricultural products, the harvest of the American continent that was changing more and more lives in Europe.
We should not forget to mention the enormous damage that this heavy industry complex has done to the world. All around the globe, we can find these industrial sites with polluted soil, the open mines, and the carbon dioxide that has been polluting the atmosphere.
Massive deforestation, widespread soil and river pollution, and above all, the enormous amount of carbon dioxide that is still being released into the atmosphere. As I mentioned before, steel production accounts for about 8% of global carbon dioxide emissions. And so, steel became the backbone of the modern world. The era of the car and the petroleum dawned much later, at the start of the 20th century. And what interests me here are these three revolutions of iron and steel. The first two that changed the world. And I think we can be sure that this third revolution, the transition to hydrogen, will not pass unnoticed.
Well, I heard you talk about the lack of technology in Sweden and the fact that 1/3 of their population migrated to the United States. But the lack of technology changed over time. 100 years ago, just like in the rest of the world, people in Luleå were working hard on new techniques. There was a blast furnace in Luleå too. Did you visit the site?
Yes. On an island upstream in the river. Now you can camp there, among old train carriages and overgrown rails. You are actually walking through an industrial graveyard, but 100 years ago the future was forged here. This was the site of the first real blast furnace in northern Sweden, until 1925. And what they made here was not steel, but pig iron, a semi-finished product. Too brittle to use directly, but perfect for remelting elsewhere. And the scale was enormous. In order to transport the ore from Gällivare, 250 kilometers away, a railway line was built through the swamps and the forests in 1888. Imagine, where for centuries only reindeer and sleighs had traveled, suddenly a steam train with wagons full of iron ore thundered through Lapland. In the beginning, the iron was melted using charcoal from the vast forests. There was even a separate charcoal quay where ships arrived with loads of charcoal. The posts are still standing in the water, and from there a cable car transported the charcoal 200 meters up to the storage facility. And you can still see the sites, the cellars of the blast furnace, the foundations of the storage facility. In 1917, the factory was fully electrified with hydroelectric power. Progressive for its time. But one major problem remained. The Gulf of Bothnia froze in winter. And the beginning of the end came in 1902, when the railway line was extended to Narvik, which has an ice-free harbor. Logistics determined everything. By 1925 it was over. The factory was bought by a competitor and shut down.
So, to understand this new revolution, you also visited a church village in Gammelstad. What does a church village, a UNESCO World Heritage Site with 400 houses, have to do with the future of steel?
We also visited a number of interesting places to understand the consequences of the third steel revolution. In Gammelstad, for example, we learned how Sweden managed to build a community and keep it informed.
So, it's about building a community. How did that work in practice?
Let's talk about religion in Sweden first. While history books suggest that Scandinavia became Christian in the 10th century, the process actually took much longer. During the 15th century, the start was made to build a church here. The current stone church was consecrated in 1492. The wall around it was built to deter intruders and mark the boundary of the sacred grounds.
What changed inside the church after the Reformation?
The Reformation started in Sweden in 1523, when King Gustav I established his Lutheran state church. The Gammelstad church was only Catholic for 31 years. And with the Reformation, the murals were whitewashed and the altarpiece was removed. A pulpit was added, reflecting the Lutheran focus on preaching rather than ritual. The current Lutheran Church has fewer problems with its Catholic past, so today the murals and the altarpiece are on display again. But one practical problem remained. The region was so vast that it was impossible for many farmers to travel to church and back in a single day. And this is why the church villages were built. Small houses where people could spend the night. These villages naturally became marketplaces and places for exchanging ideas. And of course, marriage markets for the young adults. And you can still see the church wall. The collection of small houses is still there too, and really beautiful. We were given a guided tour. The tour guide told us that today, it is a Saturday, it is very busy because several baptisms are taking place in quick succession. Between two baptisms, we were allowed to enter the church. After that, we also visited one of the houses. I picked up an interesting detail from the conversations around me. Saami people were not welcome here.
But what does this have to do with the Steel Revolution?
Viking culture revolved around migration and exploration, raids, trade, new settlements. But with Christianization, all of that changed. The state church preferred to keep the people in one place. So Gammelstad is a tangible example. Here the king used the church to bind a scattered population into a community. There was also a positive side to being rooted in one place. The church and the state created the basis for a shared identity. People belonged to something larger. They could be proud of it. Children were taught to read. Literacy spread widely and society moved forward. In many ways, the Protestant Church genuinely tried to improve these people's lives. And that this progress would eventually lead to empty churches, now only visited for baptisms, that was an outcome they could not have foreseen. In the 19th and 20th centuries, major industries repeated the pattern. Philips in Eindhoven, Saltaire in England, the mining villages in Dutch Limburg and the German Ruhr area, Hershey in Pennsylvania in the USA, to name a few. In all these places, factories were accompanied by communities. And let us not forget the football club, the ultimate way to strengthen pride and belonging. So a good idea or a smart technology is never enough. Just as an army cannot function without supplies and soldiers, a factory cannot function without logistics and people. So my question for northern Sweden is therefore, do people really want to live here? Today, the mines and factories in the north pay higher wages, sometimes to 30% more than elsewhere. But money alone does not build a city. Money alone does not build a community. You need schools, healthcare, a supermarket with fresh products, places where people can meet, That is how you develop the ecosystem of a city.
What exactly do you mean by that?
I think you cannot build a community with high salaries and hired commuters. A nurse, a teacher, a police officer, they don't come for temporary work and an airport. They only come if there is a home. The core of a home is identity, not a shopping mall outside the city or the standard chains of coffee and beer in the city center. These are the same everywhere. Consider Kiruna. Relocating the church is a spectacular project, making global headlines. But once the church is back in place, who will attend? Will it become a concert hall for the tourists, or will it remain a place for the community? The real question is, what are you going to do to ensure that people want to stay here? What are the things that bring them together? What can make them feel proud? Because without that foundation, you can never build a sustainable city. And without people, there is no community. And without community, there is, and this is what I think, no steel revolution.
So you kept going further north. The next place was Jokkmokk?
We drive further north, past the Arctic Circle, and our car slows down when we see a herd of reindeer walking on the road. We are on our way to Atje, the Swedish Saami museum in Jokkmokk. And what you see and feel there remains equally poignant. The Saami, the original inhabitants of Lapland, lived as nomads with their reindeer herds. The Lutheran State Church and the Swedish government regarded their traditional shamanistic religion as pagan. Christianization became a long and often brutal process aimed at erasing their culture and identity. Swedish colonists received land and privileges, while the Saami were treated as inferior, primitive people. In that respect, Sweden was not unique. The Netherlands in Indonesia and Suriname, Canada with the Inuit, Denmark in Greenland, they all showed the same pattern of oppression. The Saami's sacred sites were desecrated and plundered. Ritual stones, the siege, and the shaman's sacred drums were stolen or destroyed. Many of these objects still sit in museums in Stockholm, even though settlers once openly boasted in their diaries about stealing them. Today, the exact locations of remaining sacred places are kept secret. Open repression has ended. The Swedish Church has apologized, and the state even helped establish the museum in Jokkmokk. But the loss remains. Between 80,000 and 100,000 Saami still live in the north of Sweden, mostly in villages. Perhaps 10,000 of them continue the nomadic life with the reindeer. But the numbers are not the issue. What has been stolen must be returned, and what has been destroyed should be compensated. If you believe that a painting looted during the Second World War should be returned to its Jewish heirs in Amsterdam, or that the Parthenon marbles belong in Athens, then why should the Saami stolen ritual stones and drums remain in Stockholm?
What does that mean for the steel revolution in northern Sweden?
That you cannot ignore this. The Saami may live in Sweden and the Swedish state will ultimately decide, but the conflict is very much alive. The same rivers where the reindeer have their roots are now being dammed for hydroelectric power. The same land where the Saami graze their reindeers is being used for mining and factories. In January 2020, the Saami community of Girjas won a historic case in the Supreme Court in Sweden. The court ruled that the Saami, based on their historical rights, have exclusive authority to manage hunting and fishing in their traditional areas, and not the Swedish state. That was a major victory for them. If Sweden is serious about building a third steel revolution, it must do so together with the Saami. Because a brilliant new idea, whether it is a technology or an economy, is never enough. You cannot claim to be building a green future while excluding the original inhabitants. The real challenge of the transition is not the technology or the money, but people. The goal should always be to build a new green future that does justice to the people who were already there. That evening we eat reindeer steak in Jokkmokk.
I see that you also visited a fort carved deep into the rocks near Boden. Did that also have something to do with steel, or was it just fun because you were there anyway?
At first glance, such a fortress seems like a relic from a bygone era. The Boden Fortress, completed in 1908, was one of Sweden's most secret places for almost 100 years. Together with 4 other forts, it formed a defensive belt around Boden, specifically intended to protect the strategically important iron ore railway. And while the name of the enemy is not mentioned on their website, it's hard to believe that was anyone else than Russia. We still saw a sign at the entrance with a warning in 5 languages to stay out. The text in the other languages was crossed out, but the warning in Russian remained. And this shows that the threat was always taken seriously. This was also true during the Second World War. During that period, Sweden's national gold reserve was stored here, a sign that the Swedes wanted to protect their neutrality and wealth at all times. The fort was carved 5 stories deep into the granite. Most of the rooms are still intact. We saw the bunk beds, the restaurant, the small hospital and the communication rooms. But most importantly, for a fort, we saw the weapons, the howitzers and the cannons that are still there. With the war in Ukraine, the Boden Fortress is once again highly relevant. We will see how the Swedes are abandoning their neutrality and how the Lulea and Boden region will once again play a crucial military role in the NATO strategy.
Well, now there is this alternative of fossil-free steel. What will change?
Well, that is exactly why I wanted to take part in this excursion, to find that out. If it really works, what will change? Have the consequences of this been properly thought through? That day, we visited the 2 most important new steel-producing locations, Hybrit and H2 Green Steel, formerly Stegra. These are not small theoretical projects. We are talking about massive industrial ventures. Hybrit is a partnership between some of Sweden's largest companies, and H2 Green Steel is a new player building a huge factory. The goal for both is the same: to produce millions of tons of steel per year, but completely fossil-free.
But how exactly does making steel with hydrogen work?
In the blast furnaces, carbon dioxide emissions don't just come from burning coke for heat. The real issue is chemistry. For high-quality steel, oxygen must be stripped from the iron ore. Traditionally, it was the carbon in charcoal, and later the carbon in coke, that bound with this oxygen. The result, steel, as the product, and a lot of carbon dioxide as the byproduct. With hydrogen, the process looks different. You get the heat you need, but the hydrogen atoms bind with the oxygen in the ore. The outcome is the same iron feedstock for steel making, but the byproduct is no longer carbon dioxide. It's H2O, water. And this is the revolutionary shift. In practice, it works through two steps: hydrogen direct reduction reactors, turning ore into sponge iron, or DRI, followed by electric arc furnaces, EAF, to refine it into steel.
And where do you get all that hydrogen from?
Northern Sweden has access to cheap and clean electricity from hydro and wind. But the scale is staggering. To transform the industry, they will need around 55 terawatt-hour annually, and that is roughly equivalent to all the current hydro production in Sweden. That electricity is needed to produce hydrogen, which is then stored to ensure a steady supply for the steel process. After years of pilot projects, developers believe the technology is now mature enough to justify building full-scale plants. We toured the sites with helmets and boots on and even walked through the furnace hall.
Have you seen anything of that hydropower?
We first saw the Dam. Its annual output is about 600 gigawatt-hour, which is 0.6 terawatt-hour. Compared to the 55 terawatt-hour that would be required in the far future, when everything is in operation, you would need almost 100 of such dams to meet the demand of fossil-free steelmaking.
So you also visited Porjus, one of Sweden's oldest and largest hydroelectric power stations. What did you learn there?
What is most fascinating about Porjus is its history. This dam was built between 1910 and 1915 in what was basically a roadless wilderness at the time. Imagine that. All the materials for this massive power station had to be transported by a makeshift railway. And before there was a railway, people had to carry the materials on their back. That was a true feat of engineering. Well, Porjus has an annual production of about 1.2 terawatt-hour. It was originally built to electrify the iron ore line, but it was deliberately oversized. It produced way more electricity than was needed. The goal was to attract new energy-intensive industries to the north with the promise of cheap, clean power.
So those plants have been around for 100 years.
That is what it looks like. This place is a perfect example of a long-term vision. But it could well be that nothing ever came out of it because they were unable to get people here. Today, the original power station is a closed museum, but it is still an incredible place. The old control room is a listed building, and the machine halls, which were considered revolutionary in their design, are still intact. There is a new power plant built in the 70s and 80s, and that is Sweden's third largest. It proves that what started as a daring project to electrify a railway line became the catalyst for the entire industrial development of northern Sweden.
You said something about the endless amounts of hydropower in northern Sweden, but that seems greatly exaggerated to me. These numbers you gave for the individual dams do not add up to the 55 terawatt hours you mentioned earlier.
Yes, I agree. It all seems a bit confusing. The large rivers have long since been dammed. What remains are smaller streams that have been deliberately left untouched, either for nature conservation reasons or because they are vital for the Saami people. There is no inexhaustible source of new electricity waiting to be tapped here. Growth will mainly have to come from wind energy, with hydroelectric power providing the stable basis. The plan is not to rely on a handful of existing dams. Instead, the projects count on a combination of measures. Large new wind farms across northern Sweden, modernization and optimization of existing hydro capacity, expanded grid connections across the Nordic countries, and new electricity imports where necessary. In other words, the myth of endless hydropower is just that. The third steel revolution will only succeed if vast new generation and transmission capacity is added.
You also visited the construction site and Stegra's test plant, didn't you?
Our minibus stopped at the lookout tower. One way, forest to the horizon, and the other, a vast factory complex under construction. In 3 years, Stegra expects to start producing 5 million tons of fossil-free steel annually. H2 Green Steel, the new name of Stegra, is a collaborative venture with many backers. Contracts have already been signed with BMW, Volkswagen and Mercedes-Benz. Clear proof of the scale of demand. At their pilot plant, we were shown the blast furnace of the future. The tour itself was limited, but in their brochure one picture stood out. Past versus future. And in the new facility, scrap steel will play a central role as a raw material.
Yes, because you would almost forget, iron is one of the most easily recyclable elements on Earth. With a magnet, you can extract it from anywhere.
Scrap can change everything. The United States, surprisingly, is currently one of the world's greenest steel producers because about 70% of its steel output comes from scrap. Recycling slashes carbon dioxide emissions, since instead of reducing fresh ore, you simply have to remelt existing steel. Of course, the climate benefit depends on the electricity grid. The cleaner the power, the greener the scrap. And that is why H2 Green Steel's choice to integrate scrap is so significant. Using recycled steel locally reduces dependence on imported ore and cuts the energy required per ton. It shows that Sweden's green steel revolution is not just about new factories, but also about using resources already in circulation more intelligently.
But wait, won't that green steel compete with other large consumers? I hear that Meta, the organization behind Facebook and Instagram, has built a data center in Lulea.
Yes, there is definitely another side to it. The demand for carbon dioxide-free electricity in the north is growing. Data centers and AI plants also require huge amounts of energy. The main reason for this competition is that the electricity here is cheap. With more demand, prices will go up. And at first glance, it doesn't look so bad. Meta's data center in Lulea consumes more than 1 terawatt-hour of electricity annually, but that is only a fraction of the amount that H2 Green Steel and Hybrit will need soon. With cheap electricity and low temperatures, the north is a perfect location for these type of data centers. The data created can be sent around the world in a fraction of a second. The fossil-free steel can also be easily traded. It's transported worldwide in slabs, each weighing between 10 and 40 tons. A wagon of iron ore, by contrast, can easily weigh 100 tons. This makes transporting these high-quality slabs much more efficient and cheaper. They are moved by train to the port and then by ship to their destination. Each slab has a unique code that indicates its origin and original materials, ensuring full traceability.
Does not this mean that ordinary Swedes will end up footing the bill, while industry and Facebook get the cheap electricity?
Yes, the risk is significant. You can already see it in Norway. Households are paying more because their electricity prices are being aligned with those in Germany. And meanwhile, data centers and heavy industry often have cheap contracts. Ultimately, society must decide who benefits from that green electricity and who pays for it.
Will green steel also change logistics worldwide?
Without a doubt. The global steel industry is on the verge of a complete overhaul. Instead of transporting coke and iron ore, traditional factories can now import high-quality, semi-finished products made with clean energy. The principle is simple. Exporting electricity over long distances is impossible, but a high-quality product made with that electricity and hydrogen can be shipped all over the world. The new logic is therefore first find the places where you have a lot of clean energy, preferably near an iron mine, but that is not essential. It is good if that place is located by the sea and you can build a large port there, because transport is preferably by water. The harbor in Lulea, for instance, still freezes over every winter, but nowadays they have much better icebreakers, so they manage to keep the harbor accessible. So, for instance, steel can be made in Australia using solar panels for electricity, or in Brazil with hydroelectric power stations. It can also be done en route, from Brazil to Europe, in the desert of Mauritania, for example, on the border with Senegal, where there is plenty of space for a huge solar power station. Electricity generated in the desert is worthless if no one can use it and it cannot be transported over long distances. But if you can use it to make fossil-free iron, it can be fantastic.
What about the other major steel-producing countries?
Russia is one of them, of course. But it is a bit different. Russia has vast iron ore and coal reserves and is largely self-sufficient. Japan has little ore of its own, so it imports from Brazil and Australia. Yet it remains one of the top producers, trying to green its processes too by using all its scrap. India and China are the two largest producers globally, with enormous demand. Neither has enough ore domestically, and they both depend heavily on imports from Australia and Brazil. From a strategic point of view, global dependence on Australia and Brazil is risky. If the sea routes carrying iron ore to Asia were ever blocked, China's steel industry and much of its economy would grind to a halt. And that is one of China's greatest vulnerabilities.
So what about Europe? Can Europe really be self-sufficient?
Europe produces about 140 million tons of steel each year, but much of its scrap is exported, for example, to Turkey and India. If more of that were kept in Europe and reused, it could make a real difference. Stegra's scrap strategy can be a game changer. Sweden itself will also face limits. Even with Kiruna, there is not enough ore to supply both Stegra and Hybrit. They too will have to look at Brazil. And this is why the geopolitics of steel are so crucial. Ore supply, recycling flows and energy costs will increasingly decide not just who makes steel, but who controls the future of the industry.
But aren't there also the import duties that you can use to your advantage?
Both the European Union and China have introduced the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, CBAM, a kind of carbon tax on imported products. This means that European steel products using fossil fuels become more expensive, as does steel imported from outside the EU without this tax. And this creates a huge market opportunity for countries that can produce clean steel or iron using renewable energy. China produces half of all steel worldwide. The greening of the steel industry is therefore not only an environmental issue for China, but also a strategic necessity in order to remain competitive on the global market.
So after all these visits, what's the bigger picture? Does green steel really matter that much?
If you look at the numbers, Kiruna produces 25 million tons of iron ore each year. H2 Green Steel plans for 5 million tons of steel. Hybrit for 2.7. Together, that is only about 6% of European steel production. But even that small percentage has far more impact than all the lifestyle changes we usually talk about.
Why do you say it has more impact?
Because steel accounts for 8% of the global carbon dioxide emissions. Change the way we make steel and you save 8% in one stroke. Compare that to aviation. All flights together make up only about 3%. Even if everyone stopped flying tomorrow, it wouldn't come close to what a steel revolution can achieve.
And what about the other sectors?
Energy generation is the biggest chunk, about 40% of global carbon dioxide. That is mostly power stations. Agriculture is more complicated. Livestock is everywhere. It is quite complicated to change quickly. Transport can become electric, but that is only useful if the electricity itself is green. And that is why steel is so crucial. It is global, central to everything and relatively concentrated in a couple of big plants.
So in your view, the climate battle cannot be won by flying less?
Exactly. Everyone must decide for themselves. I personally have never purchased a car. I hardly eat any meat and I prefer to travel by train rather than by airplane. However, I do not do any of these things because I believe they will make a difference to the climate change. The whole idea that lifestyle choices like flying less will save the climate and the planet is built on guilt rather than numbers. Important, yes, but marginal. The real game changers are industrial, energy production and steel. And that is where policy, money and innovation make the difference. So your decision to fly less may feel good, but a vote for the transformation of our energy and steel sectors is what will truly change the world. The podcast series The City as an Ecosystem is an initiative of Carolien de Jager, Hogeschool Rotterdam, and Evert Verhagen, Creative Cities Amsterdam. You can find all episodes on Spotify and on the creativecities.nl website. There you will also find any background materials in a PDF file with the same title. Today I was accompanied by Anna D. from 11 Labs. The music I found on Free Music Archive. The pieces are Crowender, Nordic, Biounit, Ambient 2, Bentwire, End of Our Existence, and another piece by Bentwire, The Bad Guy. It has a CC BY NC SA license.